We pick up today with where we left off on Tuesday, looking at religion and culture and history in the 19th century, thinking about how a lot of that background is going to be important for thinking about some things that took place within the Restoration movement in the latter part of the 19th century. Specifically, as we're thinking about some of the divisions that will take place. What originally started off as a unity movement is not able to maintain that connection, and so it starts to break apart in the 19th century, and there are several things that are kind of the forces for that. And so we're looking Tuesday and today at some of those things in general American history, and then as we get the chance, either today or next Tuesday, we'll start talking about how those things explicitly appeared in the Restoration movement as it started to splinter amongst the different groups that are developing. Majorly, this division that's taking place between the Churches of Christ and the Disciples of Christ. We left off talking about the Civil War and some of the things that were taking place in the Civil War. Of course, the Civil War, like the Revolutionary War, a highly political event. But especially with the Civil War, there was a lot of intertwining with the aspects of religion in American culture that are important to recognize here, even more so than what we have in the Revolutionary War, which wasn't as significant. But you have religious people very interested in talking and thinking about the Civil War in the context of thinking about who God is, thinking about the morality of the nation, several of those things related to a national identity. So where we ended up talking about the Civil War, particularly on Tuesday, was how both sides are thinking of themselves in terms of as Christians and thinking about the Christian God being on their side, which of course to us is, we can't fathom how particularly the South would have been able to claim God's support given the presence of slavery. But both groups see themselves as Christians. Both are praying to God for success. Both believe that God is in support of their side and their position, even though we have two diametrically opposed forces here, one that wants to preserve the Union, one that wants to divide it to protect the peculiar institution. So not only are the origins of the Civil War shaped and wrapped in religious language, the Civil War itself, of course, is understood in religious terms, so that a lot of ministers and others are using religious language to talk about the war. Mark Noll is a prominent American religious historian, teaches at Notre Dame, and he wrote a book a couple years ago called The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, making the point of how much theology was connected with the Civil War. Ministers and others are using scriptural language to describe their positions. They're using it to describe what's taking place in the war. And so the Bible, of course, provides a very important foundation for their thinking about reality to begin with, maybe more so than what we have today. Scripture would have been foremost in their thoughts, in their speech, in a way that excuse me, in a way that it isn't today. Even for Christians today, we don't talk about, we don't pepper our dialogue, unless we're talking about scriptural things or specifically religious things, we don't talk about them using scriptural language. That wasn't the case for a lot of 19th century people who would have known, especially the King James Bible. And it would have just been common, not just in the Restoration movement, but in among a lot of people, to incorporate phrases, concepts, that were biblical in origin, and especially talking about something like the Civil War. And so we're talking about a country that is saturated with biblical language, biblical culture. That's not a comment on, necessarily the religiosity of these people. And not everyone that could use Scripture in that way would necessarily have been orthodox in their beliefs. But it was just so much a part of the culture of the time that when you look at the sermons, when you look at the speeches, you can find it throughout that. And so the war is no different when it comes to that particular issue. Often as well, the Civil War was looked upon in the context of this millennial expectation that the millennium was either shortly to come through improvement, or, as was becoming more the case, that the war was signaling the soon return of Christ, the premillennial position, which would inaugurate the millennium. And when you think about the language that's used in something like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, my eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where his grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. There's a way in which a lot of people saw this as a prelude to a new age. That this is something distinct, different, is happening after this takes place, and that going through this tribulation of the war is an important component of that. And this is prevalent even in the language that Abraham Lincoln is using. So this is coming from the top down as well. There's a lot of bottom up here, coming from the common people, the ministers, but also coming from the leaders of the nation. When you read Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is a very short speech, one of the shortest inaugurations. It doesn't take you long to read. You can Google it and find it very easily. It almost is a sermon, in a sense, a short sermon, in a sense, and fits right in with how Lincoln is thinking a lot about this war, and especially the question of, for Lincoln, more so than perhaps some other people, is his uncertainty of what God is doing, but he is certain that God is doing something, and that God will be doing something in this war. Essentially, this idea is mostly termed in context of providence. Lincoln, there's a lot of questions about Lincoln's religious beliefs. A variety of denominations tried to claim him. There was even stories circulating among the Restoration movement churches shortly after Lincoln's death about I believe it's like a late night baptism or something like that that takes place. It's unclear that this had any accuracy. There doesn't appear to be any truth to but it was a very popular story for a while, just like other groups claimed Lincoln in similar types of ways. But Lincoln himself, it doesn't appear that he was very strongly Christian in his outlook, in that there's not too many references that Lincoln makes to Christ, to anything connected with Christ. There are a few, but mostly he's talking about God in a very general type of sense. wondering what God is doing in the Civil War, what outcome God is going to bring about, what God can do, working through humans, because a lot of this is emphasized, a lot of things that Lincoln emphasizes is the human responsibility in all of this. So, even in Lincoln, you would have from the President of the United States this discussion of the Civil War in terms of religion. And of course, that's true even as the Civil War ends, as people think about the aftermath, that those things are included as well. In the time period after the Civil War, particularly in the South, you have this attempt by a lot of Christians to make sense of the war, and in so doing, they have developed what has often been referred to as the lost cause. And particularly, some people have referred to it as the religion of the lost cause. And in many respects, it's important for us to see how this religious ethos maintains itself, particularly in the South, in thinking about Southern identity and Christianity and Southern culture and the war. That in the face of defeat in the Civil War, Southerners attempted to make sense of what had happened, but also who they were. Okay? So this kind of something that they can hold on to that can overcome the history of the loss of the Civil War. And so you have this mixture of Southern identity, Christian language, and the sectionalism that is still prevalent in the post-Civil War period. We can see this, some of this, in reflection of a sermon, a comment from a sermon by Melville Jackson in 1887. And stating here this day, I charge the historian of these times that he shall not fail to tell to future ages that the Southern soldier was a Christian warrior, and that he was brave, he was irresistible, because his faith was in God and in the justice of his cause. I think that should be, and that he was brave. He was irresistible because his faith was in God and in the justice of his cause. So, a couple things that are prevalent in that the statement. I mean, the Southern soldiers were Christian soldiers, Christian warriors. Now, in a country where a large number of people identify as Christian, in the 19th century, middle of the 19th century, okay, yeah, the Southern soldiers, just like the Northern soldiers, probably identified as Christian if you'd ask them. But in what way were they particularly Christian in their soldiering that was different, let's say, than the North? Well, that's not necessarily something to be discussed. It is the idea that to be Southern was to be Christian. And there is an important way to think about that the people who died in the war died not just for a political conflict, but died as Christians. That they had these various characteristics, and that they were able to identify, that these characteristics were identified because of their faith in God. And so the reason the soldiers should be honored, should be respected, should be revered, is because of the ideas that are shaped here with the presence of the Christian faith. When it comes to thinking about the lost cause, there are a couple of different components that make up the lost cause. First is the idea of a variety of Southern heroes, people like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. These are individuals who were of the highest moral character in the Southern line. Now, I don't want to disparage that. And so I don't necessarily bring this up to suggest that this was not true. Lee, from all evidence, appears to have been a very moral individual, a good moral character, well respected on both sides of this conflict. But it is the way in which these individuals are talked about, right? The respect and the reverence that they are held in. Not so much the accuracy of that, not so much to say that they weren't that. Even Lee appears to have been relatively anti-slavery, but only serves in the war because of his commitment to the state of Virginia. So, Lee doesn't appear to be any sort of immoral individual, but he is probably elevated, we might say, elevating these people to something bigger than just what we might think of as respecting veterans, respecting those that serve in conflicts. But there's something like this almost reverence for people like Lee and Jackson and others, because these are the highest moral examples, the highest moral people that should be aspired to. And so you have this kind of notion of the South as this moral, orderly society that produced these kind of individuals. There's an idealism here. While certainly there was a prevalence of Christianity, we can't ignore the amount of violence that existed in Southern culture to maintain that orderliness and to maintain that control. To overlook that violence is to ignore what had happened to people that were enslaved, people that were held in bondage, and some of the things that were done to them. Not just work. There's forced labor, obviously, but the beatings and the whippings and a variety of other things where people could be killed at will, and they would not be held responsible for that. And then also the violence that existed between Southern whites over things, right? That honor sometimes meant attacking violently someone else, some other white. So there's a lot of violence in the history of the South that gets hidden behind these great Southern heroes. And that's reflected in the midst of the Old South, that it's moonlight and magnolias. It's gone with the wind, it's honor, it's chivalry. And certainly there were some aspects of that, but there was also a lot of other things that were not accurate about that, the violence especially. Within the religion of the lost cause are also these notions of suffering and salvation. Really kind of connecting this to, almost connecting it to the sufferings of Christ. That somehow the South's suffering is redemptive like Christ's suffering was. And so this notion of connecting Jesus' death and suffering to the Confederacy becomes an important part of the thinking of people. And then finally, the notion that somehow that the Confederates were more Christian than the Yankees were. Certainly in the North, by the mid-19th century, you see the development of more liberal forms of Christianity that are less traditionally orthodox, that are certainly not things that forms of Christianity I would support or necessarily agree with. But, the idea that somehow the South was, and the Southern soldiers were more Christian than the North and their soldiers is a judgment I don't think that has been properly vetted, right? How do you make that determination? And but it's just kind of this assumed belief. that this is the case, without having any sort of specific evidence in any sort of case. So, the idea here is that the Confederates lost a holy war, that the best of Christian and Southern values was present in the Confederacy, and that these things, that these things were not enough to win the war, but are an important way to think about the South. And so, this is pervasive throughout the South. I mean, it's even still around today, not as extensive as it was in those first several decades after the Civil War, but it's something that begins to permeate the South, and really shapes a lot of Southern thinking about what it means to be a Southerner. Religion as a lost cause gets instantiated in the thinking and experience of the South in a couple of different ways. One way is through sermons by ministers, where they would talk about these Southern heroes as saints or as martyrs. And so, first of all, you have the context of, the sermon, right? A religious situation. And within that, you're using religious language to talk about the South and these Southern heroes. And so that facilitates this kind of conjoining of religion and the lost cause in the minds of Southerners. In a variety of church buildings, you have stained glass windows, like those pictured there on the right, of stained glass, of course, in churches, but usually the stained glass, if it had any sort of representation, would be of holy figures, any sort of figure, human beings in the glass. But you have these pictures of soldiers, of Confederate heroes. These over here on the right being depictions of Lee and the Confederacy. That there's this kind of conflation of biblical saints and Confederacy, these heroes in the stained glass, so to speak, in churches and in other places. There are a variety of sacred relics that pop up. For example, the Bible used by Jefferson Davis was kept under lock and key by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, because not only is it the Bible, and so it's sacred because it's the Bible, it's sacred because it's Jefferson Davis's Bible. There would be, you see the beginnings of these museums where medals, flags, uniforms, weapons are kind of put there, it's not just a historical focus. There is that religious focus of these are relics, not just historical objects, right? With relics being holy objects. There would be hymns sung at Confederate gatherings, some of which were revisions. This one particularly, for example here, of an additional verse of when the roll is called up yonder. On that mistless, lonely morning, when the sage of Christ shall rise, and a many-mansion home to share, where our Lee and Jackson call us to their homes beyond the skies, when the roll is called up yonder, let's be there. Right? So this idea of Jackson and Lee are going to call people home. So that's another part of this. The funerals of soldiers. People dressed in their uniforms. The bodies would be dressed in uniforms. Guests would be dressed in uniforms. There would be military ceremonies for these people. Now, again, we're talking decades, sometimes, after the end of the Civil War. There was even the development of a Confederate veterans burial ritual, where the veteran was looked upon as going to an honorable grave, that they had fought the good fight, And finally, this notion of the Confederates being a noble, virtuous people. Again, that's not to suggest that these soldiers weren't somehow virtuous, but there's something extra being added here. And so, this mindset of the South and what it means to be Southern. Variety of memorial monuments and shrines. By 1914, there were over 1,000 monuments. Battlefields were considered to be pilgrimage sites. There were statues with religious phrases, like "Our cause is with God," for example. You see the development of things that are specifically called shrines, more of a religious terminology, that are on battlefields or the graves of particular individuals. And so these rituals help institutionalize the lost cause in the mindset of the South. So you have groups like the United Confederate Veterans, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans, using this notion of rhetoric that's very sacred, reunions that would be held where people would start with prayer. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, for example, would start their meetings with "We are gathered in the sight of God." Churches also became a place for institutionalizing this the lost cause. The God of the lost cause was the biblical God. Church buildings would be used for observances, memorials, funerals, fundraising for monuments, and not just for religious activity, not just for Christian worship services. Even in the educational system, Confederate veterans and their widows dominated the school system, teaching Southern tradition, using pro-Southern textbooks. Of course, the development of private religious academies would have played into this as well. So you have this mindset in the South of, that this was a religious endeavor, that the South is inherently religious, and that's evidenced by the people that were participants from the South in the Civil War. Really kind of setting up a sectionalism, a sectional identity of this region, and that there's an antagonism here with the North. As we move on into the latter part of the 19th century, there are a couple of things that develop that will be important for our thinking about the Restoration movement. We'll certainly talk about some of those previous things in the context of the Restoration movement. But in the latter part of the 19th century, there are a couple of things taking place that will profoundly affect the United States and will profoundly affect religion in the United States as people begin to think about what does it mean to be an American. One aspect of this is the increase in urbanization. Prior to the Civil War, especially in the South, culture was largely agrarian. And even in the North, there certainly were the development of larger cities. But in the post-war period, more and more people are flocking to cities because that's where they feel the jobs are. And certainly, that is the case to some extent. And so you have people moving to cities, the development of sizable cities, and the development of newer cities. With that is largely due, part of the reason for urbanization is industrialization. The development of manufacturing jobs is what leads people to the cities. With industrialization, of course, came a variety of additional consequences, the impact on the environment, etc. When in a culture that isn't as concerned about that as we might be today. But the appeal of industrialization is to mass produce things. It is to produce things that hadn't been able to be produced before. And so that kind of effort at this time period needed a lot of workers. And so that leads to the migration of people. It's also leading to people to migrate throughout the country, going to these cities. Large numbers of African Americans, for example, will leave the South and the agrarian system there, move to the Midwest, particularly places like Detroit, other urban industrial centers, Chicago, to find work, and with that, hopefully find a better economic situation. But you also have the rise of immigration and a variety of different groups coming from different places in Europe predominantly. And as they come to the United States, they, depending on the group and depending on the languages they use. So, for example, from the 1840s on, there's large numbers of Irish people that come to the United States. Speaking English, they have a little bit easier time assimilating. Certainly there's a lot of stereotyping prejudice towards the Irish that takes place in the mid part of the 19th century, even sometime into the later part. But there was a little bit easier time than it was before someone from Germany or even Italy who does not speak English or does not speak it as well. Also, depending upon why some of these groups left, sizable numbers of Catholic immigrants come, and so they're concerned about how Protestants are going to treat them. So you have a lot of these ethnic ghettos develop, where people of the same ethnicity or nationality tend to group in a specific place, specific parts of some of these towns. So this is where you get your German towns connected with some of your major cities. Sometimes your little Italies. Later, of course, is when you get your Chinese quarters. Certainly, Jews based a lot of that part of Chinatown. That was the phrase I was looking for. Chinatowns. That's kind of more into the 20th century, although there's still some of it in the 19th. Jews often found themselves, either forced to or through their own choices live in some of these ethnic areas. So you have this what's theoretically a melting pot, but there's still a lot of division, hesitancy, separation that's taking place in a lot of these places. With that, there is also a lot of fears. People that are concerned about a variety of issues. And so there are people who are afraid of what modernization means, particularly if they have a view of being agrarian, being closer to God, as a lot of people did. I mean, even Thomas Jefferson suggested the notion of agrarianism kind of being human nature's natural state. And so, as society modernizes, and this happens every time society modernizes, and sometimes appropriately. I mean, there's certainly a lot of things that come with modernization that can be problematic. But in the late 19th century, there were great concerns about what is taking place, especially as these modern developments in industrialization, urbanization, some other things like that. Of course, with the rise of immigration, there are a lot of people coming to the United States, people who come with different languages, different cultures, maybe even different modes of dress, especially those first generation of immigrants. And so there's a lot of fear that people have about these immigrants, especially the concerns about, are they going to take our jobs? Are they? And with that, of course, is the prejudices of people from this particular country are this particular way. They either can't be trusted, or they're extremely violent, or they are, all sorts of things that people invent about people from other countries. When you think about some of the things that happened in the most recent election. And some of the comments that were made about people from Mexico, for example, and as well as people from Muslim-majority countries. There's this kind of stereotyping, and as immigration takes place, there is an increase in people fearing the presence of people from other countries that they don't understand or don't know about. Additionally, in the latter part of the 19th century, more and more people turned away from religion as a means to understand reality. Believing that there were other realms, spheres of knowledge, there were other approaches, there were other scientific information that better defined or helped religion define what reality was. And that, of course, led to a lot of people abandoning traditional religion, either turning to forms of non-traditional religion or turning to forms of agnosticism or skepticism. And, that was then a concern for a lot of people as well.